Welcome to the Everything History Podcast for episode 51, De Caesaribus by Sextus Aurelius Victor, part 5.
What we do here is go back.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
As I said last time, please note that I myself, Thomas, the narrator, interrupt at no point. So when the first person is used, that is Victor speaking, not me. Also to be mindful of, this book is not without flaws. There are many inaccuracies and prejudices that are written as facts by Victor. They are not. Much of the information contained within De Caesaribus is flat out wrong, but most of it is correct. This is especially true for the Caesars, or emperors as we call them, that the senatorial and equestrian classes despised. Victor also occasionally speaks in a manner that contemporary individuals might find insensitive. Section 38. Consequently, Carus, who was the most powerful because he held the praetorian prefecture, was clothed in the imperial robe, and his sons, Carinus and Numerian, became Caesars. And since all the barbarians had seized the opportunity to invade once they had learned of the death of Probus, he sent his elder son to defend Gaul, and, accompanied by Numerian, he straightway proceeded to Mesopotamia, because that land is, so to speak, a customary cause of war with the Persians. There, after routing the enemy, while he was advancing beyond Ctesiphon, Parthia's famous city, with an ill-advised and excessive desire for glory, he was burnt to death by a bolt of lightning. Certain men state that he deserved this, for although the oracles had informed him that through his victory he was permitted to reach the city just mentioned, he advanced further and paid the penalty. So you see, it is hard to divert the fates, and for that reason knowledge of the future is pointless. However, Numerian, after losing his father, at the same time decided that the war was over, and while he was leading his army back, he was murdered through the treachery of Aper, the praetorian prefect, and his father-in-law. An infection of the young man's eyes provided the opportunity for this. In short, the deed was concealed for a long time, while the body was being carried in a closed litter on the pretext that he was ill, so that his eyesight might not be troubled by the wind. Section 39. But after the crime had been betrayed by the odor of his decomposing limbs, at a council of generals and tribunes Valerius Diocletian, commander of the household troops, was selected because of his good sense. He was a great man, and he had the following characteristics. He was, in fact, the first who really desired a supply of silk, purple, and gems for his sandals, together with a gold-brocaded robe. Although these things were well beyond good taste and betrayed a vain and haughty disposition, they were nevertheless trivial in comparison with the rest. For he was the first of all, after Caligula and Domitian, to permit himself to be called Lord in public, and to be worshipped and addressed as a god. From these indications, as far as I can understand, I have concluded that all men from the humblest backgrounds, especially when they have attained exalted positions, are excessive in their pride and ambition. For this reason Marius was in our ancestors' time, and he in ours went beyond the common limits, since a mind that had never experienced power is insatiable, like a man saved from starvation. Consequently, it seems strange to me that most people accuse the nobility of arrogance, whereas, in preserving the memory of its patrician origins, it has some right to assert its eminence as compensation for the annoyances by which it was afflicted. But these faults in Valerius Diocletian were effaced by the other good qualities, and especially by the fact that although he allowed himself to be called Lord, he acted like a parent. And it is fairly certain that this shrewd man wanted to demonstrate that it was the harshness of circumstances rather than of titles that created obstacles. Meanwhile, Carinus, informed of what had happened, and in the hope that he might more easily put down the revolts that were breaking out, hastily made for Illyricum by skirting Italy. There he scattered Julianus's battle line and cut him down, for the latter, while he was governing the Venetia as corrector, had learned of Carus's death, and in his eagerness to seize the imperial power, he had advanced to meet the approaching enemy. Moreover, when Carinus reached Moesia, he straightway joined battle with Diocletian near Margus. But while he was in hot pursuit of his defeated foes, he died under the blows of his own men, because he could not control his lust, and used to seduce many of his soldiers' wives. Their husbands had grown increasingly hostile, but they had nevertheless put aside their anger and resentment to see how the war turned out. Since it was going quite successful for him, in fear that a man of such character would become more and more overbearing in victory, they avenged themselves. That was the end of Carus and his children. Narbonne was their native city. They ruled for 2 years. Consequently, Diocletian, in his first speech to the army, drew his sword, gazed up at the sun, and while attesting that he had no knowledge of Numerian's murder, and had not wanted the imperial power, with one blow he transfixed Aper, who was standing right beside him. It was through this treachery, as we have now shown above, that the good and eloquent young man, his son-in-law, had perished. Pardon was granted to the rest, and practically all the enemy were restrained, especially one outstanding man named Aristobulus, the praetorian prefect, on account of his services. This was a novel and unexpected occurrence in the history of mankind, that in a civil war no one was stripped of his possessions, reputation, or rank, for we are delighted if such a war is waged with all due observances and with mercy, and if a limit is set on exiles, prescriptions, and also punishments and murders. Why should I recount that many men, foreigners too, have been admitted into partnership in order to protect and extend Roman authority? For when Diocletian had learned, after Carinus' death, that in Gaul Helianus and Amandus had stirred up a band of peasants and robbers whom the inhabitants called Bagudai, and had ravaged the regions far and wide, and were making attempts on very many of the cities, he, Diocletian, immediately appointed as emperor Maximian, a loyal friend who, although he was rather uncivilized, was nevertheless a good soldier of sound character. He subsequently received the surname Herculeus from his worship of that deity, just as Valerius Diocletian received that of Jovius, that is, Jupiter. That was also the origin of the names given to the auxiliary units, which were particularly outstanding in the army. Herculeus marched into Gaul, and in a short time he pacified the whole country by routing the enemy forces or accepting their surrender. In this war, Carausius, a citizen of Menapia, distinguished himself by his clearly remarkable exploits. For this reason, and in addition because he was considered an expert pilot, for he had earned his living at that job as a young man, he was put in charge of fitting out a fleet and driving out the Germans who were infesting the seas. Because of this appointment, he became quite arrogant, and when he had overcome many of the barbarians, but had not turned over all the booty to the public treasury, in fear of Herculeus, who, he learned, had ordered his execution, he seized the imperial power and made for Britain. At the same time, the Persians were causing serious disturbances in the east, and Julianus and the Quincugentian people in Africa. Furthermore, at Alexandria in Egypt, someone named Achilleus had donned the insignia of supreme power. For these reasons they, Diocletian and Maximian, appointed as Caesars and made marriage alliances to Julius Constantius and Galerius Maximinus, whose surname was Armentarius. After annulling their previous marriages, the former received the stepdaughter of Herculeus, and the latter Diocletian's daughter, which is what Augustus had done in the case of Nero Tiberius and his daughter Julia. Illyricum was actually the native land of all of them, so although they were deficient in culture, they had nevertheless been sufficiently schooled by the hardships of the countryside and of military service to be the best men of the state. Consequently, it is evident that men are more readily made honorable and sensible by enduring adversity, whereas, on the other hand, those who have not experienced misfortunes, as long as they judge everyone according to their own situations, are less considerate. But the harmony of these rulers has definitely demonstrated that natural ability and the experience of a successful military career, such as they are received through the precedent of Aurelian and Probus, are practically sufficient to ensure merit. Finally, they used to look up to Valerius Diocletian as a father, or like a mighty god. The nature and importance of this attitude have been made conspicuous by the crimes committed by the relatives from the founding of the city to our own times. And since the burden of wars, which we have mentioned above, was pressing more insistently, the empire was divided into 4 parts, and all those regions of Gaul which lie across the Alps were entrusted to Constantius, Africa and Italy to Herculeus, the coast of Illyricum right across the Strait of Pontus to Galerius, Valerius Diocletian retained for the rest. As a consequence then, the immense evil of taxation was imposed upon part of Italy. For although all Italy paid the same moderate levy to support the army and the emperor, who were always or mostly there, a new law for making payments was introduced. It was no doubt bearable in that period of moderation, but it has grown into a ruinous monster in these tempestuous times. Meanwhile, Jovius set out for Alexandria, and his area of command was entrusted to Maximian Caesar, so that the latter might leave his territories and advance into Mesopotamia to repel the attacks of the Persians. At first he was seriously troubled by them, but he quickly gathered an army of veterans and recruits and marched against the enemy through Armenia, which is almost the only, or at least the easier route, to defeat them. There he eventually captured King Narses, together with his children, his wives, and his royal household. He was so successful that if Valerius Diocletian, at whose command all state affairs were conducted, had not for some unknown reason forbidden it, the Roman fasces would now be carried in a new province. But some of the territories which were nevertheless quite useful to us were acquired. The recent very serious and destructive war which has broken out is because they are now being demanded back with greater insistence. But in Egypt, Achilles was easily put down by negotiations and paid the penalty. In Africa, the situation was dealt with in a similar manner, and only Carausius was allowed to retain his sovereignty over the island of Britannia. After he had been judged quite competent to command and defend its inhabitants against warlike tribes, he, in fact, was treacherously overthrown 6 years later by a man named Alectus, who, after he had been entrusted by the former to manage the treasury, fearing execution because of his misdeeds, had seized power through a criminal act. When he had exercised power for a short while, Constantius destroyed him through Asclepiodotus, who was his praetorian prefect and was sent ahead with a detachment of the fleet and of the legions. In the meantime, too, the Marcomanni were slaughtered, and the whole nation of the Carpi were transferred to our soil, where some of them had already been settled from the time of Aurelian. And with no less regard for the concerns of peace, the bureaucracy was regulated by the most impartial laws, and by the abolition of the malignant clan of Frumentarii, to whom our current agentes in rebus, that is, intelligence agents, are very similar. Although they appeared to have been established to investigate and report whatever disturbances might crop up in the provinces by outrageously fabricating charges and inspiring fear everywhere, especially in all the most remote areas, they would shamefully plunder everything. At the same time, the city grain supply and the welfare of the taxpayers were carefully and responsibly safeguarded, and by the promotion of a better class of men and, on the other hand, by the punishment of all villains, enthusiasm for virtues began to increase. The most ancient religious cults were looked after with the utmost respect, and in marvelous manner the hills of Rome and other cities, especially Carthage, Milan, and Nicomedia, were embellished with novel and beautiful elaborate buildings. Nevertheless, in spite of these achievements, they were not without faults. In fact, Herculius was so driven by lust that not even the bodies of his hostages were safe from his sick desires. Valerius Diocletian, too, had little genuine faith in his friends, doubtless through his fear of conflicts, since he thought that the harmony of the partnership might be disturbed by disclosures. For this reason, too, the forces of the city were, so to speak, pruned down when he reduced the number of praetorian cohorts and common citizens under arms. And very many believe that it was indeed on this account that he laid down the imperial power. For, in fact, he was a close examiner of imminent events, and when he discovered that on account of fate, intestinal disasters, and, as it were, a sort of disintegration of the Roman state were threatening, he celebrated the 20th year of his reign, and while still in quite good health, he gave up the administration of the state after he had, with very great difficulty, converted Herculius, who had been in power 1 year fewer, to his point of view, meaning he made him retire as well. And although regard for the truth has never been corrupted because people have different opinions, nevertheless it seems to me that he spurned ambition and stepped down to ordinary life because of the excellence of his character. Section 40. Consequently, since Constantius and Armentarius succeeded them, Severus and Maximinus, natives of Illyricum, were appointed as Caesars, the former for Italy, the latter for the regions that Jovius had held. Unable to tolerate this, Constantine, whose proud and capable spirit had been stirred ever since boyhood by the passion to rule, reached Britain in a planned escape, since he killed all the post horses along the route he had traveled in order to frustrate his pursuers, for he was being detained by Galerius as a hostage on the pretext of obligation. And by chance at the same time, in the same place, his father Constantius was approaching the last days of his life. At Constantius's death, with the support of all who were present, Constantine assumed the imperial power. Meanwhile, at Rome, the common people and the praetorian units confirmed Maxentius as emperor. although for a long time his father Herculius restrained him. When Armentarius learned of this, he hastily ordered Severus Caesar, who happened to be near the city, to engage the enemy. The latter, while he was operating around the walls, was deserted by his men, whom Maxentius had subordinated with the inducement of rewards, and fled to Ravenna, where he was besieged and died. Galerius was further enraged by this, and, after consulting Jovius, he installed Licinius, a long-standing friend, as Augustus, and, leaving him to guard Illyricum and Thrace, he marched on Rome. While he was there, being held up by the siege, since his soldiers were being tampered with in the same way as their predecessors, he abandoned Italy in fear that he might be deserted. Shortly afterwards, when he had made an area in Pannonia quite useful to the state by cutting down vast forests and draining Lake Pelso into the Danube, he died from an infected wound. Because of this, he called the province Valyria after his wife's name. He had ruled for 5 years, Constantius for 1, although of course both had held the rank of Caesar for 13 years prior. They were so remarkable for their natural abilities that if those abilities had emanated from cultivated minds and did not give offense because of their boorishness, without a doubt they would have been considered exceptional. Consequently, it is indisputable that learning, refinement, and courtesy are essential, particularly in emperors, since without these qualities natural talents are despised, as if they are unfinished or even crude. Yet on the other hand, those very qualities assured Cyrus, king of the Persians, of everlasting glory. Moreover, within my own memory, they carried Constantine up to the stars with the prayer of all. Even though he demonstrated other such virtues, certainly if he had set a limit to his lavishness and his ambition, and to those practices in particular to which mature men of genius progress in their quest for glory, and through which they fall too far in the opposite direction, he would have been practically a god. When he learned that Rome and Italy were being devastated, and that 2 armies and 2 emperors had been driven off or bought off, he made peace throughout Gaul and marched against Maxentius. At that critical time on Punic territory, Alexander, who was acting as deputy prefect, had foolishly usurped his supreme power. Although he himself was enfeebled by age, was more dull-witted than his parents, who were Pannonian peasants, and his soldiers had been recruited in a hurry and had hardly half of their weapons. To sum up, Rufius Volusianus, the praetorian prefect, and some generals were dispatched with a mere handful of cohorts by the pretender, Maxentius, and they polished him off in a minor skirmish. After his defeat, Maxentius, the inhuman beast, made more abominable by his excessive lust, had ordered Carthage, the glory of the world, along with the loveliest parts of Africa, to be ravaged, pillaged, and burned. In addition, he was actually an unwarlike coward, and shamefully inclined to indolence, to such a degree that, while war was ravaging throughout Italy and his troops had been routed at Verona, he went about his customary business with no less apathy, and was unmoved by the destruction of his father. For you see, Herculius, who was more intractable by nature, and at the same time dismayed by his son's apathy, had rashly sought to regain the imperial power. And as he was plotting to make a vicious attack on his son-in-law Constantine, on the pretext of doing him a service, he had eventually met a deserved death. But Maxentius, growing more ruthless by the day, finally advanced with great difficulty from the city to Saxa Rubra, about 9 miles away. His battle line was cut to pieces, and he was retreating in flight back to Rome, and when he was retreating in flight back to Rome, he was trapped in the very ambush he had laid for his enemy at the Milvian Bridge while crossing the Tiber in the 6th year of his tyranny. It is incredible how joyfully and delightedly the Senate and people exulted at his death, for he had oppressed them so much that on one occasion he permitted the praetorians to massacre the common people, and he was the first, through a most reprehensible edict issued under the pretext of an obligatory state taxation, to compel the senators and farmers to contribute money for him to squander. Because of their aversion, the praetorian legions and the support units, which were more useful to factions than to the city of Rome, were entirely eliminated together with the bearing of arms and the wearing of military uniforms. In addition, all the monuments, which Maxentius had constructed in a magnificent manner, the temple of the city and the basilica, were dedicated by the Senate to the meritorious services of Flavius. He also afterwards completed the decorations on the Circus Maximus in a marvelous fashion, and built a bathing establishment which was not very different from the others. Statues were erected in the busiest places, and most of them are of gold or silver. Then in Africa a college of priests was decreed to be the Flavian gens, and the town of Cirta, which had been demolished during the siege of Alexander, was rebuilt, fully redecorated, and given the name Constantina. Indeed, nothing is more welcome and more distinguished than those who expel tyrants, and respect for them will actually be so much greater if they are moderate and self-restrained. Naturally, people's spirits, once they are disappointed in their expectations of something good, are hurt more grievously when the abundance of their hardships remain in spite of the removal of a shameful ruler. End of section 40. Remember that you can contact me on the podcast Facebook page or at the email address everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.